Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and joining me today for our discussion is Ted Piccone of the Brookings Institution, author of a new book, 5 Rising Democracies, on the role of 5 new emerging economic and political powers and the impact they will have on what he calls the international liberal order. Welcome to the show, Ted.
Thank you very much, Siddharth.
Now, the premise of your book is that India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and South Africa, 5 liberal democracies, emerging economies, accounting for a quarter of the world's population in some ways, they are going to potentially shape the way in which agendas like democracy and human rights will be pursued at the international level. So let me start with the devil's advocate question. You seem to assume that in the pre-existing world order, democracies such as the US, the UK, France, etc., factor highly or rate highly democracy promotion and human rights. Is that really the case?
I think
and are they consistent about it?
No, they're not consistent.
Okay.
All democracies have double standards and a very mixed record when it comes to integrating democracy and human rights issues and their values into their foreign policy. But I would say it's a matter of degree. And what I've seen over time is that there are some democracies that take on this issue more than others. And I would say my research showed that these rising powers have a very ambiguous approach when it comes to addressing issues of human rights and liberal values in their foreign policy, despite the fact that by character they are democracies and they're quite proud of their status as democracies. Many of these countries have gone through dramatic transitions from apartheid, from military dictatorship, into a much more open and liberal system, much closer actually to India. And I think that is a very positive trend in the world. And that trend has also led to great improvements in economic growth and in human development terms. I mean, poverty rates are going down, literacy is going up, life expectancy is going up in these societies. So in effect, this democratic political system has responded to the popular demands for change. And they've also been able to show good economic growth. The question is, as they aspire to greater power on the international scene, what will they bring to the table, and to what extent are they willing partners in this project of supporting democratization around the world?
But you're assuming that there's one size that fits all, or there's one model. For example, what would supporting democracy in Egypt mean today? Would it mean supporting General Sisi, as the US apparently does, and the rest of the world for that matter? Or would it mean India or Brazil or South Africa being more proactive in pointing out human rights violations and violations of rule of law by the Egyptians? I mean, it's not very clear what the pro-democracy stand would be in a situation like that.
Well, I think actually there is no one model fits all. Let me make that very clear. Democracies take lots of different forms, but I am talking about a certain liberal representative democracy with checks and balances, with independent institutions, judiciaries, freedom of the media, etc. So this kind of it's not just elections. But in the case of Egypt specifically, I think major mistakes were made in the way the US approached this. It was very clear that there was a military coup, and the US couldn't call it a military coup because under US law that would require cutting off assistance, and we don't want to cut off assistance, we the United States government, because we need Egypt in this very volatile neighborhood. And as a result, we twisted ourselves in pretzel about whether this was a coup or not, which is ridiculous. Yeah. I think there's also no question, as we've seen in so many coups around the world, that coups are very damaging to any progress and respect for human rights. And often the reaction to a failed coup also leads to that result, as we've seen in Turkey.
I dare say if the Turkish coup had succeeded, we would have seen a lot of pretzels being made
yes,
in Western capitals.
Especially as a member of NATO. It would have been incredibly complicated for the United States and the NATO members. So we didn't get to that point. That's good. But of course now Erdogan, following his much more authoritarian path, is cracking down on journalists, academics, anyone who can really check his growing power. And I find that a real threat to democracy in Turkey, and really Turkey no longer belongs in my thesis, because they are not really complying with basic democratic standards.
Right.
But I think in the case of Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood won the election, it was Turkey actually that was very actively supporting that government. And then when the coup happened, it was Turkey that said this is a clear violation of democratic rules of the game. And
Turkey
where's
found
the
itself
West?
isolated, exactly.
Yeah. So it's I think probably one of the best cases of the double standards that the U.S. and others have.
Right. Is Indonesia a bit of an outlier in this group of five?
Maybe because it's the newest in terms of its democratization process, but it very much fits in terms of the way it has embraced democracy as, given the diversity of its population, much like India, where religion is important, but it's not the dominating factor in the way government works. They decided early on in their independence years that Islam would not be the state religion. And so that was a critical decision for them, as now they're in a more democratic process. They have a better balance, I would say, in terms of the role of religion in public and political life. But I think Indonesia also does have aspirations to really be a leader, at least in ASEAN, in its region. And it also played an important role in ASEAN in moving it toward putting pressure on Myanmar, in moving it toward democracy, in creating a human rights commission within the body. They also an outspoken convener of something called the Bali Democracy Forum, which brings together Asian states to talk specifically about democracy. Right. So I think Indonesia is one of these quiet players behind the scenes that could play an important role. Jokowi, I'm not so sure if he's really going to follow on the path of Yudhoyono, but the fact of his election as someone coming from not the political elite and reaching the presidency is another demonstration of Indonesia's aspirations.
I'm glad you brought up Myanmar, because many in this part of the world would argue, in the context of the thesis of your book, that the Asian way of dealing with the democracy and human rights agenda, which is one of engagement, not having sanctions, not treating the military regime in Myanmar as an outcast or somebody that you can't deal with, ultimately proved to be more effective than the European, American, North American approach of having no contact, declaring sanctions. In that light, would you say that even though a country or a group of countries like the five, don't explicitly articulate or don't embrace the language of democracy promotion and human rights in their foreign policy in a way that the US does, but despite that, they may actually be more effective in pushing parts of that agenda forward?
Yeah. No, I think that's one of my conclusions of the book, that we ought to look for quieter ways of diplomatic, both carrots and sticks. I mean, I think in the case of Myanmar, good cop, bad cop may have actually been together what moved the needle in Myanmar. But ultimately, it was because the leadership in Myanmar decided that it was time to move down this path. I mean, yes, international pressure had a role, but it wasn't the decisive role. But the fact that it was this combination of carrots and sticks may have actually been the right approach. If we'd done all one or the other, we don't know. It's a hypothetical. But I can give you another example where this choice has been made to disastrous results in the case of Cuba. The United States has imposed this very onerous, comprehensive, punitive embargo on the Cuban people for over 50 years. And it has not achieved their goals. And in fact, it has isolated the United States from the rest of the international community. And so I think there's an important lesson to be learned there, that this type of hard, coercive, isolation approach doesn't work. And we need to try for engagement. And engagement, of course, means not just engaging the government, but engaging other parts of societies. And in general, most countries, the people want more openness. They want more rights. And so if you have a government like the United States or India choosing to be on the side of the people, I think ultimately over time you get to a better, more stable outcome.
Right. So is there a need to draw a line somewhere? I mean, where does the subtle promotion of an agenda end and more blatant forms of intervention begin? We've seen many, the pushback from Russia and Central Asian countries in the light of these so-called color revolutions. Do you think the US pushed the envelope too far, was too active in creating pockets of resistance towards these governments?
Yes, I think the particularly decisive moment, in my view, when you look at the democracy promotion agenda of the United States was Iraq, because the way that was cast as a democracy promotion through the point of a gun, regime change, set back the agenda enormously. And I think we still haven't recovered, frankly. So that is not the right way to go about it. And we've alienated a lot of our friends and allies with that approach. And now we have other incidences since then that have also complicated the picture enormously. Responsibility to protect was the justification for intervening in Libya, but it was mishandled. It was used as a tool of regime change, and a disaster was left in its wake with no true follow-through to put Libya back together again. As a result, you have a fracturing of any consensus on how to handle Syria next door, which is a much worse situation. And I think it's a very sad situation because just on humanitarian grounds alone, the scale of killings and destruction really demand an international response. And yet, because of China and Russia's views against any sort of US intervention, they've blocked any serious action to support change in Syria, and so it's a tragedy.
Right. As an American analyst and somebody who obviously values the importance of human rights in the international order, the international system, how do you look at or respond to some of the backsliding we've seen over the last decade in the US, but also in other liberal democracies when it comes to customary norms against torture, principle of non-refoulement for refugees? Does this worry you? Do you feel that there has been a slippage away from what was considered something you do not derogate from, and into rather slippery territory?
Yeah. No, I think the US and other democracies are going through a stress test, and it's largely because of the rise of violent extremism and the responses to that violent extremism, which is creating war, actually. And I think this stress test, it's not clear where we're going to come out. Certainly in other periods of our history, we have clamped down on civil liberties dramatically. Are we in the same kind of wartime emergency mindset? Look what's happening in France, where democracies feel the need to make some trade-offs in favor of security and away from human rights. And I think we're seeing that tension, and it's sliding toward security. I don't think it's a fundamental threat. I think there are many institutions and there's a culture within democracies that allow for debate and self-correcting those mistakes, but staying within the boundaries of a democratic constitutional rule of law system. So I feel like there'll be some corrections along the way. Certainly on torture, we're having a very active debate because some of the presidential candidates have said, we have no problem with torture. Sure, we'll torture. This is such a gross violation of international law and US law.
US law, exactly.
And President Obama, to his credit, has tried to make that very clear. But even in the United States, we have not had true transparency or accountability of the torture that was committed. And so we still have a long ways to go in making effective this declaration against torture. But it worries me a great deal. The non-refoulement principle and the way the rhetoric has turned so negative against not just migrants but refugees specifically is actually shocking to me. people are reacting.
Not so much in the US, but in Europe, yeah.
Yeah, but also in the US. I mean, the fact that they're saying...
People like Trump are saying things, yeah, exactly.
Are saying no refugees can come into our country anymore. And some governors at state levels are saying, we will not accept any Syrians in our country. This does not reflect the America I know. I mean, I've seen, and they're not the dominant view. Right. They get a lot of headlines, but that is not the dominant view. And just to give you a quick counterexample, the sanctuary movement, in which migrants and refugees are received in communities and protected, and transition to jobs and social care, that is happening throughout the United States.
Just come back to the book again. If we take a historical view, we understand quite clearly how during the Cold War, the promotion of so-called liberal democratic values, human rights, fitted in quite nicely with US geopolitical interests, its competition with the former Soviet Union. Since then, the world has changed, Cold War's ended, bipolar division is gone. That geopolitical compulsion which operated no longer obtains. That was also the cause for double standards often in US policy. But today, where are the institutional drivers in the US? Which sectors or sections of the foreign policy decision-making community in the US are the ones who are most wedded to the idea that human rights and democracy ought to play an important part in US foreign policy? And the reason I ask is because obviously in a country like India, which is also going through a change in the foreign policy formulation process, some of these factors may be important.
I would say that as a general matter, the United States, in both parties, there's a bipartisan consensus in favor of promoting our values, and that democracy and human rights is not only a good thing to have in the world, but it's actually in our national security interest. And this started in particular during the Reagan years, and each successive administration, Republican and Democrats, to different levels of emphasis, have made this point and have integrated it into our national security strategy. So when you read those documents, you see that the United States expresses its strategy as this is good for our security. And in fact, there's good research, good evidence to show that over the long term, democracies are more stable, are less violent, do not spawn refugees, etc. And in fact, often do better economically in terms of human development. And that's a lot of what the research of my book shows. Now, going forward, I think President Trump probably would not be that interested in that. In fact, he wants to draw the United States back. He's made it very clear that he thinks we're overextended, and this whole idea that the neocons have promoted of changing the world in our image is a big mistake. So I think we have a much clearer choice on this issue in November than we've seen in the past, where contrary to what I said about bipartisan consensus, he is an exception to that general rule.
Whereas Hillary represents the establishment view in a way.
I think so. I mean, she was very good on these issues when she was Secretary of State, and before that. I mean, I traveled with her when she was First Lady to Latin America, and she always was an advocate for these issues, particularly women's rights, but not exclusively. And as Secretary, she was also a big promoter of internet freedom, digital rights, which really is one of the 21st century issues.
Obviously, a lot of curiosity in this country about the presidential election, and in particular Mr. Trump, who is an unknown quantity. Hillary is known what she stands for, what kind of an administration she would run. But the question everybody has here is, we've heard what rhetoric Trump is engaged in. If elected, to what extent do you expect as an analyst that he will follow through on some of those statements? To what extent will the US deep state or deep establishment, or the policy, the kind of consensual policy which has emerged over the last 50, 60 years, to what extent will that be able to prevail?
That's a great question.
Are we looking at massive shifts or something just on the edges?
So I think there's a lot that the president as commander-in-chief can do to change US foreign policy. And he will set a certain tone, first of all, and second of all, can issue all kinds of executive decisions to really fundamentally change the direction of U.S. foreign policy. So now Congress can respond and react and check him in different ways. And I think they would do that. I think there would be a very strong pushback, not only at the political level, but also at the bureaucratic level, because you also have to bring along your bureaucracies if you want to impose those kinds of changes.
Right.
But let me say this, he, as a matter of public record, for many years, not just as a candidate for president, but as a private citizen, has made it very clear what his views are. And what he's saying now represents what he's been saying for many years, which is that he's
just like nobody took him seriously in the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now he's a political candidate for the highest office in the land. And so we have to pay attention. But he's been consistent in his opposition to trade agreements, his criticism of China, his sense that the U.S. is a loser, we're losing all these deals, we spend too much money on NATO and protecting Asia Pacific, etc. I think he's going to try to do everything he can to carry through on those.
Including diluting Article 5 commitments on NATO?
Well,
NATO countries didn't take very kindly to that.
It's really hard to imagine, but he's out there saying it. And then you throw in the relationship with Russia, and you really get to a very fundamentally different world order that I think, going back to the basic subject here, is a direct threat to democracy and human rights in the world.
Right, exactly. Ted, on Trump and China, I mean, there's lots of aspects of Trump's foreign policy or potential foreign policy that we could pick on, but is the assessment that he will lead a more muscular US policy towards China a correct one? Are we going to see more tension, not just South China Sea, but other areas of contention between the US and China?
So I think Trump approaches foreign policy the way he thinks of business. He wants to cut a deal. So I think he's the kind of guy who would go to the table and negotiate and try to find a better arrangement that he thinks would be more in the U.S. interest. But it doesn't mean necessarily more muscular in a military sense. Okay. I mean, I think he's made it clear that he doesn't want to extend our military beyond our shores. Right. So it's more of a concern in terms of the balance of power in the Asia Pacific. Where do Japan and South Korea end up? And he's even gone so far as saying maybe they should develop their own nuclear weapons, which is such a fundamental threat to our not only national but world security in terms of non-proliferation. So these things really are very hard to find any consistency in actually how it would work. But
and I think parts of what he's saying, like he wants to get rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. I'm sure the Chinese will be quite happy because that they're not part of it now, and to the extent to which TPP was designed to put pressure on them, they'd be quite happy at this. So it's hard to square parts of these agendas.
Yes, because they have their own effort to try to create an alternative trade agreement, and we're seeing China's interest, and they're spending money to invest in alternative structures. The new development bank of the BRICS and the currency reserve funds are all efforts for China to establish itself as a leading power. And sometimes there's alignment with U.S. interests, but often not. And so Trump, I think, is looking at it much more from a very parochial United States view. But he also has to factor in that China is holding most of our treasury bonds.
But it's a weapon they can never use.
Well, that's true. That could be true. And China's economy is softening, so maybe it is a good time to try to revisit some deals. But the way he would go about it, I think, would be so disruptive that he would find resistance from internally and externally that would be almost impossible to override.
Right. And Japan and ROK, South Korea, would be feeling quite uncomfortable with the idea of America retreating into... I'm sure sectors of opinion in Japan, for example, would welcome this, those who favor more muscular Japanese policy. But this is going to complicate security in the Asia-Pacific region.
Well, it's true. Sure. The withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Japan, there are a lot of people in Japan who would support that. Yes. But overall, I think at the official level, it's been a win-win. So this is the sense of the U.S. being a security provider around the world and the willingness to do that because it's in our interest. And we have spent a lot of money doing that. And also President Obama's more recent public statements about, hey, we don't want to do it alone. We need help. And we need to have burden sharing from our allies. Right. And that would include in not just military terms, but in other ways, India and other countries, other democracies that have a like-minded system of government share certain values, but that's not always translated on the international scene.
Right.
For good reasons, I understand why, but I think there's more room for cooperation over time.
Well, we have to leave it there. Ted, it's been a fascinating discussion. This has been a discussion with Ted Piccone, author of 5 Rising Democracies. And of course, we're entering US presidential elections where the fate of the so-called oldest democracy is up for grabs, and what kind of policies it pursues will influence the world order much more than, I suspect, these 5 countries. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And if you've been watching, thank you. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you.